Hi, I'm DJ Butler. Welcome to Ring of Fire Con and a panel on the challenge of writing non-traditional fantasy. I'm going to start here by allowing our panelists to, I'm very happy to be the moderator because that means I don't have to say anything. They're going to talk. I'm just going to poke them and make them keep talking. That's my
Ow,
only.
ow, ow.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll let you all introduce yourselves, and we'll go in the order in which you appear in my interface. So that makes Shoshana first. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? But I think one thing that might be particularly interesting is in what sense do you write non-traditional fantasy?
Oh, well, okay. My name is Shoshana Edwards, and for years I was an academic. Neurolinguistics is my specialty, so you can imagine I've been having a lot of fun this year with a certain person, figuring out why he talks the way he does. Um, I love language. I absolutely adore language. And all of my writing in the past has been pretty much academic, but I had to give up creative activity in 2019 because my hands went numb. And one creative door closed and another creative door opened, namely writing fiction. I'd never been able to write fiction before because I couldn't come up with a storyline. And I woke up one morning with this idea in my head that said, what would happen if you took what appeared to be a perfectly normal, nice little Midwest town and dropped a creature of mythology in the middle of it? A creature of mythology that was basically evil and pretty much lived to kill. And so that's what my first novel is about. And because at the time we were so focused on Ukraine, I remembered that my first folk tales had been my father reading to me from Ukrainian and Russian folk tale books. And believe me, their mythology is pretty nasty. So I said, you know, I love mysteries. I read a lot of mysteries. Jeffrey Deaver is a big one of mine. I love Spencer, Miss Spencer desperately. And so that's what I did. And I can't see writing fantasy any other way. For me, it's take something that doesn't belong in the real world as we know it, put it there and see what happens.
So a couple of questions, if I might.
Sure.
So, what's the creative activity, if you don't mind telling us? What did you lose? Are you a sculptor or something?
I was a quilter.
Oh, a quilter. Oh, yeah.
I was an artist in fabric art. Won a lot of awards, had quilts all over the world, and then my fingers went numb and my eyesight went. And it's kind of hard to cut fabric, and it's kind of hard to sew little tiny seams when you can't see and feel. Yeah. And I was really excited to write because I love to write. I shouldn't say I never wrote fiction. I had the incredible pleasure of sitting in the window of Change of Hobbit twice with Harlan Ellison, writing a short story in 2 hours, which was a real challenge. And I loved Harlan, and I had the great gift of living in LA and being a part of Losfus. So I suppose somewhere in the back brain it was there waiting to get out. And I just had to kind of make room for it.
Fantastic. And sorry, one last question. I'm not trying
Sure.
to delay hearing about the other panelists, but when you say you studied neurolinguistics, did you study also languages as well? Do you read Ukrainian?
No, actually, you're going to think this is really weird. I have a particular brain dysfunction and I cannot learn foreign languages. What I do study is language patterns and how people use, okay, for example, take a new lawyer. He wants to impress. He uses a lot of lawyerese.
Sure.
And the longer he gets, the more secure he is, the less lawyerese he uses. People who feel inadequate or unsure will use big, inappropriate words to try and demonstrate a false sense of superiority. There's a word that they're using for it now that I can, Schadenfreude.
Or Schadenfreude is a different thing.
Yeah, I can't think of the word right now. The brain's getting old too. I mean, look, I published my first novel when I was 76, and now I'm almost done with the second one. So I'm living proof that you don't get old but easily, but sometimes the brain cells go.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
All right,
Well,
cool.
I'm grateful to Eric. Eric took a chance on me, and Ring of Fire Press took a chance on me, and I love him for it. And that's shameless plug.
Very good. All right, Reich, tell us about you and the senses in which you write non-traditional fantasy.
All right. Well, I'm Reich E. Spoor. I've published 23 books, is it now? And more on the way. I write a lot of things in a lot of different genres. I've covered everything from hard SF all the way down to epic fantasy. Obviously, some of that is what I would consider fairly traditional. The Phoenix books are fairly traditional. It's a standard epic quest. But I think things like Princess Holiora are non-traditional, certainly here in the West, which is because it's a Mahou Shoujo, a magical girl adventure novel, which I don't think until that one was published that there'd been an English written magical girl adventure done before. Some of my other fantasy stuff may also be non-traditional in other ways. For example, the second book of God's War, which is coming out next year, will, among other things, sort of reference the Coromandel series, which had a sequence in which an armored personnel carrier fights a dragon. Well, I decided to nod to that in a really big way, and I have a literal starship involved in a conflict against a god. So I don't think that's exactly traditional.
Sounds like Star Trek V to me, though.
No, that was where the god wanted the starship.
Oh, I see. Okay, fantastic, Reich. Glad to have you. Thank you. Now, Maurice, am I saying that right? Forgive me. I meant to ask before we start.
Maurice Broaddus.
Fantastic. Maurice, we're meeting for the first time, I think. I have a terrible memory for people, so if that's wrong, pretend that that's true.
I got you.
Okay. And tell us about you and about the senses in which you write non-traditional fantasy.
Okay. Well, my name is Maurice Broaddus. I'm a community organizer, a teacher, and an author, science fiction, fantasy, and horror. I have about a dozen books published, I think now over 100 short stories published. And I don't know, I think, I guess it depends on your definition of traditional. Maybe if traditional speaks to the issue of our default settings, then the ways in which I write non-traditional fiction would be I write stories based on the folklore of my community. I get to draw on African folklore and mythology. I get to draw on, my mother's from Jamaica, so I also get to draw on Jamaican folklore. And so my first novel trilogy was the Knights of Breton Court. And it was a retelling of the Arthurian myths, except I set it in modern day Indianapolis in the middle of my neighborhood. So, that's a combination of my love of fantasy as well as my love of crime novels. And so I guess part of doing it unconventionally is not having been steeped in traditional fantasy. I didn't come up reading traditional fantasy, so I get to come at it in a different way every single time. So my most recent novel is Pin My Airship, which is a steampunk novel, mixing all sorts of sci-fi and fantasy elements. And again, it's just a matter of just coming at it from a different cultural perspective.
So when you talk about traditional fantasy, another way to think about that might be sort of Tolkien imitating as a strong Tolkien-influenced medieval Europe-centric kind of fantasy.
Right. And I just never come at it from that sort of perspective. Even though I was born in London, so I guess I should admit that bias too. So I am technically a British citizen in addition to an American citizen, but I default to African storytelling and Jamaican storytelling.
Indianapolis.
And then try and do as much set in Indianapolis as possible.
Yeah. Okay. Very cool. Very cool. All right, Nathan, tell us about yourself and about the respects in which you write non-traditional fantasy.
Well, I actually got to writing kind of like Shoshana pretty late in life. I started out as an electrical engineer and electrical engineering manager and spent about 30 years in industry. Proceeded to the University of Texas at Dallas, where I spent 22 years on the faculty. But while I was at UT Dallas, I've always wanted to be a writer, and it just seems like circumstances intervened. And I started very seriously looking at writing. I started going to the Superstars writing seminar, started making friends among writers. And Shoshana, I got you beat a little bit. My first novel was sold to Wordfire Press when I was 77.
Well, darn.
Not too long before my 78th birthday. Since
Mazel
then,
tov.
and by the way, the acquisitions editor of Wordfire Press at the time was this guy named Dave Butler. So I owe my career to Dave Butler. Thank you, Dave.
That dumb bastard.
And since then, I have sold 5 more novels to Wordfire Press,
Wow.
including the 5-novel series, young adult, the Shadow Warrior series, and another one called The Freedom Conspiracy that's coming out next month. I then, this year, was fortunate enough to sell a 3-novel trilogy to Eric called the Long Winter Trilogy. The first book just came out. You may have seen it if you follow their debuts. It's called The Portals of Hell. And then just to celebrate my 80th birthday, which was in July, I sold a 10th book, I,1, about the first intelligent android to Ring of Fire as well. So I've sold 10 novels in the last 3 years, 6 of which have been published. And I'm having a hell of a lot of fun for an 80-year-old, okay?
Nathan, what is your last name?
Dodge, just like the car. And by the way, Rick and Maurice and Shoshana, hi, I'm so glad to meet you guys.
Long I, Reich.
Right, sorry.
No problem. Everyone does that.
It's Dutch, isn't it?
It is. It was originally the IJ ligature, so it'd actually be more pronounced Reich. But you're not going to do that in America. It would just make I would try to pronounce it and go Richard, and then I'm Red Jack from Star Trek, and I am die, kill you all, kill you all. So none of that would work out.
Yeah.
Well, it's a real pleasure to meet all of you. Some of you are old friends, but many of you I'm meeting for the first time. So I think, from my notes, when we talk about non-traditional fantasy, I think that we at least sort of viscerally initially are talking about writing from a different cultural perspective, including maybe deliberately drawing on different myths and legends and informing stories, right? And then a couple times the idea of genre came up, and that fantasy consists of the traditional fantasy may mean certain kinds of genre, and that writing fantasy that is a different genre is a way to write non-traditional fantasy. Other thoughts, though? Are there other ways? And if you have examples from your own writing or somebody else's writing, that would be great. Are there other ways to write non-traditional fantasy? Is there anything else we're missing here?
I was thinking about this today, and I was thinking in terms of all people, Misty Lackey. I was thinking about her Elemental Master series, which is quite obviously fantasy, and how she has taken basically magical people and dropped them into a very real world with non-magical people, and her magical people doing non-magical as well as magical things. And to me, that's a very compelling kind of non-traditional fantasy. I guess I'm a little tired of elves and orcs and dragons. I don't know. But I just like this whole idea of the real world suddenly becoming at loggerheads with the magical world.
I think there's certainly an interesting element of that, the intersection of the real world and the supernatural and such. Another way that I've seen a non-traditional approach, any of you know Harry Connolly, his work?
Yeah.
Harry Connolly wrote a book called A Key, an Egg, Fortunate Remark. And that had several elements that I don't consider traditional for even urban fantasy. There's all sorts of divisions of fantasy, obviously. But, you know, like if we take, say, Jim Butcher as a typical urban fantasy, well done, but typical, you know, we've got your sort of PI protagonist and investigation of the supernatural. Connolly took this, but one of his main characters is a little old lady called Aunt Marley. And one of the things about her is that while she has magic and she uses it in subtle ways and never uses it for violence. And not because it's impossible to do so, but because apparently she did when she was younger. So she's sort of the atoner. She is making up for her misuse of this power when she was younger. And she's actually cursed in a very interesting way that we don't find out until later in the book, where we find out that there's a reason that she's always having her big, strong nephew always, you know, open the doors and help her through places. It's because she is cursed such that if she opens a door and goes through it, she doesn't know where it goes. It can take you anywhere, including 30,000 feet out over the ocean. But it's non-traditional to me in that she's a very unusual type of protagonist that you don't see, and the way in which she uses her power is very unusual.
That's interesting. And so we're again kind of around the space of genre, but you're talking about, hey, unusual point of view characters or protagonists, and a different use of tropes or avoidance of some of the tropes. I think it's very interesting.
Yeah. So I have 3 examples I think that come to mind. So one, I'll start with my work and then broaden out. So with the Knights of Breton Court series, for example, that's basically, I mean, as much as it is in some ways you could go, oh, well, it must be a traditional fantasy because it's a retelling of King Arthur. Yeah, but it also betrays my love of crime writers like George Pelecanos. So, I mean, it's King Arthur by way of George Pelecanos, for example, with a story that takes place very much in my neighborhood. And basically it was an excuse for me to flip a lot of tropes, you know, and turn a lot of the fantasy tropes upside down in the telling of that story. So that's one, the elements of flipping tropes. The second example that comes to mind would be N.K. Jemisin and her 100,000 Kingdoms trilogy, where she comes at fantasy but decides, you know what, I'm going to make up this entire mythology that hadn't been seen before, and I'm going to tell the story through this mythology that I've created myself. To, again, spectacular effect because, you know, I love N.K. Jemisin's work. And then the third example would be Marlon James. His first book, I know is a trilogy, but Black Leopard, Red Wolf. And so again, so now it's kind of in the Tolkien model in that he is making up languages. He's making up a mythology. He's created this new landscape, but it's all African based. It's not European based. So he does all the groundwork of creating a new language and creating this whole new landscape. But the setting is very much African, and so it's a very much African-based storytelling and the feeling of that mythos. So those are my 3 examples.
Oh, fantastic. Nathan, any other thoughts or examples you want to add?
The one I could think of the most is sort of actually in my own experience. When I wrote my Long Winter trilogy that is now going to be published by Ring of Fire, I was writing science fiction, and I've always considered myself a 100% tried and true, absolutely thorough and devoted science fiction writer. And while I have dabbled in fantasy, I've really written very little fantasy. And then when my editor, who happened to be a guy named Dave Farland, was helping me edit the Long Winter trilogy, Dave thought it was fantasy. And so he even referred to things in there differently than I would. And I suddenly realized that in this supposedly science fiction story, which is really sort of a dystopian novel set very, very far in the future, it had many elements of fantasy. And in fact, you could regard it as a fantasy completely, and it lost all its resemblance to science fiction whatsoever. So I think that sometimes uh, we can add so many fantasy elements to science fiction that, to me, we end up with a hybrid, which in my opinion is the kind of thing we're talking about. It's certainly non-traditional, and yet it's a marriage of both the genres, and it can be pretty satisfying. As I begin to understand what I'd written, I said, by golly, yeah, this is really sort of both. And I can thank Dave Farland for that.
Yeah. Well, and the similar thing happened with me, The Knights of Breeden Court. When I wrote book one, which was Kingmaker, I came up as a horror writer. So I thought I was writing a young adult horror novel. It just happened to have King Arthur in it. It's when I sold to Angry Robot, then they were the ones who said, "Oh no, this is an adult urban fantasy novel," and I'm like, "I'm not an urban fantasy writer," and they're like, "Yeah,
Now you are."
Now you are, and I'm like, "Oh, okay, well, all right, now I'm an urban fantasy writer."
Mine sort of went in the reverse. When I first published Digital Knight, one of the comments that I would get from people was, "This is actually science fiction." And the reason that they would say that was because the main character, Jason Wood, has no special powers, and he solves all of his problems by rational scientific means. He analyzes the supernatural thing he's facing and then applies rational, sort of MacGyver-like approaches to deal with it. And it was very systematic and rational, and that was actually what ended up with me writing hard science fiction with Eric Flint, because I like the way that you write about these things technically, in a way that makes me understand what's going on there without boring the crap out of me. So I think that there's many ways that you can end up crossing the different genres, science fiction and fantasy. You can do it by putting the paradigms of science into it, which has become, of course, a lot more common in more recent years. I think due to a large extent due to role-playing games, where a lot of the players want the system to make sense. The world has to have some sort of mechanical logic to it, and that tends to bring you back to some sort of a scientific viewpoint. Or you can, like Shoshana says, you can take a normal world and just pitch something magical into it. In the Fall of Veils series that Kathleen and I are writing, and that's getting published, the second one's being published right at the beginning of this convention. One of the things we've done there is to build a world that looks very much like ours on the outside at first. Carefully, there are these little details which don't make sense, and that's because behind the scenes is this entire supernatural world which has changed some of the subtle history that we have seen. And then eventually, over the course of these, basically 9 is our planned novels, the supernatural world will come out, the magic comes back, and the entire world will go through an apocalypse and a rebirth. And one of the non-conventional aspects of that to me is that it follows so many people. The book is not, it is a series, but there's no one protagonist or even 2 protagonists. It's a ensemble where different protagonists get in the spotlight as you go along, and then you'll come back to the first one, and then you'll go to a 4th, and so on and so forth.
So this is good. We've talked about various ways in which you can write a non-traditional fantasy and exemplars. Let me just throw one more out. I mostly want to hear from you guys, but I got to throw one out. And that's Susanna Clarke's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell.
Oh, beautiful book.
Yeah.
Beautiful book.
Yeah, lovely. And two of the ways that's really striking are, one, its voice, which is very much not a traditional fantasy, straightforward narrative.
I would say it's absolutely traditional, just from like 1889.
You're right. It's a traditional voice for Jane Austen, right?
Yes.
That's the voice it is. And so it's striking to hear this sort of, knowing, omniscient, wry, bemused narrator talking about Jonathan Strange trying to master British magic as it is. of returning, and also so voice and also format. It can't be the only one, but it's the only fantasy novel that comes to mind that immediately has footnotes, right? And lengthy footnotes that are often funnier than the text that you're reading.
I will. There is one that I can think of,
yeah.
and it's in the sort of inverse to Jonathan Strange thing, where it's more modern, and that's Charles Stross's Laundry Files.
Oh, interesting.
He often has a lot of footnotes in them, often detailing some of the bizarre background of the laundry, which is his super secret, we take care of the supernatural problems of the world organization. That by itself, I think it's a very non-traditional fantasy series, because there's stories about the Cthulhu mythos, which are clearly horror, and they're all about the unknown and how human beings can never comprehend and blah, blah. And then Strauss takes these and he throws them quite deliberately into the mold of other genres. The first few books are the mold of various spy thrillers. So he's got one that's, God, I'm pulling blank the names. Obviously, one is Ian Fleming, but he goes through like 3 or 4 or 5 of these, and then he does another one which is a meet cute and the hero and the princess thing and then just twists it in his usual Lovecraftian way. But it does also have the footnotes.
Very cool. I've not read Strauss. I've seen other novels. Infinite Jest, right, famously has footnotes. It's also, like for most of us, sitting on my to be read pile rather than actually having been read. So I have to, but I believe it has footnotes.
One of the oldest of the non-traditional, oldest in the sense that it's, decades old, but not hundreds. Illuminatus. If you didn't read the Illuminatus trilogy, I'm not sure you want to read it today, but it was certainly bizarre in its day and might be worth reading now, but it sure had footnotes too.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
In my first novel, Death Lives in the Water, I very, very intentionally wanted to keep a very sharp line between my major protagonist, Jim Birch, who's the sheriff, who was a former big city detective, and some of the people living in the town who are descendants of Ukrainian pagans and are practicing pagans themselves. And one of the devices that I found that worked real well for doing that was having Jim be very much the forensic scientist. I can't tell you how many hours I spent talking to Pat McEwen and others about getting it just exactly right. How do they do a crime scene? If you're a cop, how do you do a crime scene? And then having the pagans looking at the same crime scene in a very, very different way, looking for very, very different things. And Jim comes to a crisis in Death Lives in the Water because he's seen something that his cop sense and knowledge can't explain. And he knows that if he crosses that line, if he steps over the line from being pure cop to going into that magical world, he's going to lose something that the town needs. Because I've got the town calling people it needs, and it called him. And so I had to get a character who would explain to him that, yes, he can see the other side of the line and still stay on his side of the line. Very, very hard stuff to do, because I keep wanting to make Jim magical.
Well,
and I keep knowing that I can't.
This is a really good transition point. In theory, at least, the subject of the panel is the challenges, right? The challenges of writing non-traditional fantasy. And I want to end on a higher note. So let's talk about challenges first, and then we'll come back and talk about, the beauty and why you want to do it. So one challenge, right, Shoshana, is look, if you're writing an elves and dwarves and capes and chainmail fantasy, you can kind of do it in your sleep, right? If you played D&D a few years, and you've read Tolkien 5 times, and you seem to crank out a B fantasy, that is not a problem. So one challenge is you may need to master other kinds of genre or technical knowledge, like you're talking about, Shoshana, what are other challenges? What are downsides or risks or costs of writing non-traditional fantasy?
Audience would be the first one. If you're, I mean, your description makes it so that, well, it's easy to write really sucky fantasy, but a lot of those sell partly because they're familiar. A lot of people want something that is in the familiar vein. So
I would go farther than that, Reich. I would say the best stuff cannot sell the largest numbers, because I think you have to be hitting the main part. You have to be hitting the large part of your audience. I absolutely agree.
Well,
I think plausibility. I think plausibility. Sorry, Reich. If I'm going to do a non-traditional fantasy, meaning I've not got trees that talk to you or elves or any of that other stuff, none of that chicks and chainmail stuff. If I'm writing a non-traditional, if I'm throwing fantasy elements in there, they have to be plausible in that real world. They have to be plausible to the non-magical people.
That's an interesting principle. What do you mean by plausible, I guess? Because supernatural is by nature not plausible.
Okay. What I mean by that is, I'll just use my own book as an example, if I'm forgiven to do that. I've got a Blotnik. He lies in the shallow waters and drowns people. He eats people. He eats animals. He's pure evil. He once was human, but he is now pure evil and lives only to kill. How do I convince people that it is plausible that this critter showed up in a little town in Missouri? I have to create a vehicle for it to arrive there because it's Ukrainian, and there has to be a reason that he's there.
Okay, so what you're saying is not so much that it's a plausible being because it's supernatural and it doesn't make sense.
No.
Human beings don't transform into things that live underwater, but that you have to have a reason for the sequence of events. There has to be a logic to it, a consistency.
Yes, there has to be a logic to it, and there has to be plausible how they deal with it.
Yeah, so I'll try and breach both of those two things. So on the one hand, in my Kingmaker book one, by the time you get to the fact that there is a dragon living under the projects, you go, by the time that reveal happens, you're like, oh, of course there is. Because I've built the world in such a way that by the time we get to that reveal, it makes perfect sense. So in that way, so that would be the plausibility thing. On the flip side, though, I risk losing my audience because I had a lot of pushback when the books came out of, well, this is not my King Arthur. That's not what my King Arthur would do. And I'm like, true. I don't know what to tell you because this is the King Arthur story I am telling. So yes, it's not the King Arthur story you were used to. I'm going to touch on some of the familiar things, but in the end, it's going to be the King Arthur story I'm telling. And you do risk blowing a market at that point.
I had people say the same thing about my werewolves I created for Digital Knight / Paradigms Lost. They write into, but this isn't the vampire werewolf stuff that I expected. Okay.
Right.
And Marcus, that brings us right up against the wall of who do we write for? Do we write for our readers or do we write for ourselves?
No, there is no wall for me because all of my stories, every last one of them, I write for me.
Yeah, me too.
I
me
am
too.
the ultimate market. So I will write a novel. I will write a novel, and I will trunk that novel. I'll trunk this novel in a heartbeat. The only reason Pimp My Airship didn't exist, except in my trunk, until I talked about it on a panel, and then all of a sudden people were like, "Well, we want to read that book," and I'm like, "I guess I can't direct you to my trunk. I suppose I ought to try and sell it." So, but I'd written that book for me. Because I didn't think there was an audience for the steampunk story that I was telling. So I wrote it, and I was perfectly content it being a novel for me and not seeing the light of day. So I am always my first audience because I'm writing for me. I'm writing to see the stories I haven't seen before, and I'm writing to see the stories I wish I could read now.
I think there's an interesting sort of there's another idea here that bridges actually audience and something close to plausibility. And we're talking about something you lose when you walk away from standard fantasy, and that's not plausibility, but it's familiarity. It's very easy to say elves, and the reader has in her head a whole bunch of ideas. So if you're Larry Correa and you go elves, but they live in a trailer park, right? You can turn on wheels inside the reader's head with very efficiently, right? And you lose that if you're dealing with a really science fiction setting the characters.
Well, that was sort of what I was getting at when I was talking about audience. You've got an audience, they're used to these things and they know them. So if you just you can evoke them with 3 words, where a new concept will require 300 words to evoke. And I've often said that the challenge of writing urban fantasy is overall easier, in my view, than either hard science fiction or, epic, deep otherworld fantasy, because urban fantasy assumes this world. We're all familiar with cars and mail and computers and all that, so we can just throw that in there and everyone knows what it is, so we just have to add in the little bits that are funny. But if we get to in really detailed otherworld fantasy, you got to build the whole world.
Right.
In hard SF, you have to adhere to principles of the world that most people aren't going to bother to think about. You got to most people don't have to calculate orbits. In Star Trek, they point the ship that way and it goes. But if you're using real rockets and everything, suddenly you've got to say, it takes me 3 months to get from here to there, and this is the only way that I can do it. And if I get it wrong, it's going to be 6 months, and all these other details of how you do it. Yeah. So with fantasy, we've got a whole bunch of tools that were handed by the genre. And if we're doing untraditional, we're starting to throw away the tools and we have to start making our own.
And by the way, audience means, right, we're putting at risk sales. Can I continue my series? Will the publisher buy any more from me? Making a living, right? So it's not a trivial thing to say, as Maurice does, hey, I fundamentally write books for myself, and you guys can like it or not. That's a bold thing.
But at the same time, I think for
Perhaps
people like
it's a
Maurice
privilege.
and me certainly, and I think Shoshana, that it's not choice. If you said, Reich, I want you to write this story, and it was a story that I couldn't see writing for me, I'd have to say, sorry, no. Even if you said, look, you could be the next J.K. Rowling with this. It's like, that sounds really great, but I can't write it because it's not something I'd write. There are sometimes you can say, there's several things I might write, and you say, write that one because it'll sell, but it's still got to be one from me. And I think Maurice is basically making the same point, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the gamble. It's just I'm pretty. Yeah, I bet on me. That's pretty much been the hallmark of my career. I'll roll the dice every single time and just just bet on me. I mean, because worst case scenario, I fail, but you know what? In the end, I'm satisfied. So I'm like, hey,
at least you can read it.
At least at least I can read it, and then B, I mean, that's the risk we take. Anytime we want to do something new, it's a risk. It's a gamble. And so there might not be an audience for it now, but there could be an audience for it down the road. I tell you what, so I wrote a middle school detective novel in 2012 because I wanted to write a middle school detective novel. The protagonists were 2 young Black boys. Mm-hmm. And in 2012, that book is dead on arrival.
Yeah.
So it was in my trunk. In 2016, that book is in high demand. And I happen to have one handy. So now so then when I try to sell it, it takes me 2 weeks to sell. So I write the books, I write them for me, and then I'll wait to publish well. I'll wait to see what the market's like if I can sell it. But if it's in my trunk, again, I wrote it for me. I'm perfectly entertained by that story. So.
Well, I don't want to put words into Nathan's mouth, but I suspect that he and I have a certain kind of privilege that maybe the others here in the panel don't have, the privilege of being retired and having an income without having to do that day job or having to sell a book to pay the rent or buy the food. At least that's my privilege, and I respect that privilege. I acknowledge it. It lets me write whatever the hell I want to write.
I'm glad you're calling out Nathan, because Maurice is taking us exactly where I want to go, which is talking about why you want to say, why you would do this stuff. But we haven't heard from Nathan for a while. I want to make sure, Nathan, that we're not talking over you. So what would you like to add about challenges for writing non-traditional fantasy? Or do you want to take us forward into the conversation about what's great about it, what attracts you?
A couple of things, and you're right, Shoshana. I am retired, which makes it nice. Although, frankly, I didn't retire from UTD until 2 months before my 80th birthday, so I haven't been retired that long.
Brave man.
I'm kind of like Maurice. By the way, I wanted to comment. I kind of write for me. When I was planning this 5-novel trilogy that I sold to WordFire, I talked to Rebecca Mesta about it. Some of you may know her. And I said, Rebecca, this is what I'd like to write. And she said, no, nobody's buying young adult SF right now. And so I went ahead and wrote it anyway, wrote the 5 books, and eventually sold them to WordFire. And frankly, they're not selling that well, but nevertheless, I wrote it because I wanted to write it. And so, Maurice, I'm right in there with you. When it gets down to the challenges of writing this kind of what do you want to call it? Hybrid fiction, science fiction with fantasy elements, or vice versa. I think it comes down to the kind of story you're trying to tell. I just read a short story, and by the way, just about my 2 favorite magazines in the world are the Grantville Gazette and Galaxy's Edge. And this is in the new edition of Galaxy's Edge. It's a story by a guy named Eric Nunnally called The Bone Kite. And it's about, Maurice is nodding his head, maybe you read it.
Big fan of Eric.
Yeah, the story, I'm not gonna get all the details, but it's about a woman who is more or less trapped in her 12-year-old daughter's dream, and the daughter is dreaming she's 4. And it's just a fantastic, I don't mean in terms of fantasy, but just a beautiful story, just a very moving story. And I felt like that the fantasy elements were handled beautifully, because really this could be science fiction. I don't know about you, but when I think of a science fiction story, I kind of think of The Lathe of Heaven, right? Where you can have a dream that can affect reality. And so I think when it gets down to this, how to write this hybrid, these hybrid fantasies or hybrid science fictions or whatever, I think it just depends heavily on the story you're trying to tell. And in my case, in the case of this trilogy, the Long Winter trilogy, it was necessary because I wanted to have a sense of wonder in this story. And the only way I could evoke it was in adding a lot of these fantasy-like things. And so it's science fiction, I staunchly believe, but it's got a lot of fantasy in it.
That's interesting. So to evoke certain effect in the reader, right? You're talking about to achieve a sense of wonder. You broke the rules of genre, or you write a non-standard genre piece. Great. What else? What other reasons why, if you're giving advice to a young writer who's or a beginning writer, right, who's watching us?
Stop! Don't!
Stop. Yeah.
It's too late. Before it's too late.
But you don't mean non-standard fantasy. You just mean writing.
Yeah. Well, that's it. But if you got to write, okay, non-standard fantasy, whatever. For me, I guess one thing that I'd say is, I sort of distilled out of what everyone else has already said. You do what you want to see. Do what you love. even if it scares the living crap out of you. That's my example of non-traditional fantasy, of my non-traditional fantasy experience as exemplified by Princess Holy Aura. That book scared me. I came up with the idea and I threw it in with 2 other pitches that I sent to Bain because I knew it wouldn't be chosen. There were 2 other much better proposals in the rational point of view, but they chose Princess Holy Aura. Now, just to give you the quick idea, one of the key idea of Princess Holy Aura, if you know anything about Maho Shoujo, the magical girl thing, the basic essence of it is that you've got a teenage girl, usually early high school or really late junior high, who meets up with some sort of a being, usually some cute animal, that gives them the power to fight evil. They get to transform into the powerful magical girl and fight evil, and they will gain other friends who will also be magical girls, blah, blah, blah. The twist that I put into mine was that in this one, the cute animal who is really a powerful wizard and is the one who's doing the choosing, is sick and tired of choosing children to fight this battle. But he can't change the form of the warrior nor the way in which the entire conflict progresses. What he can do is choose a different person for the first and central magical girl. So he chooses a 35-year-old man named Stephen Russ, who has to become Princess Holy Aura, and then has to get the other magical girls who are by the spell constrained to be actual teenage girls. As you can see, there are landmines of all kinds scattered through this. And so I'm writing it in half terror, half enjoyment as I'm saying, this is going to be cool. This is going to get me burned at the stake. And finally, at the end, as I often said, I'm tap dancing through landmines here. And at the end, when I reached the final thing and wrote the end, my beta reader said, right, you managed to tap dance that whole way through. And I'm not sure there's a better feeling than to have managed to walk through all of that tension and terror and enjoyment of writing and then come to the end and say, you know what? I did what I wanted to do and it looks pretty good.
I would agree with
successful art, the accomplishment of doing something unique and beautiful.
I would agree with the idea, with the advice of do what you want to do. I was kind of told that I might be a bit Pollyanna because ultimately, no matter how bad or how awful things get, I believe in redemption. I also believe in community, and I believe in the power of community. And if anything underlines my writing, it's the power of community to heal wounds, to come together, to fix things, to make things right. I recently sold and had published in Grantville Gazette a short story called Lord Dampnut Loses His Hair. And if you play with anagrams, you know who Lord Dampnut is. Even with that character who is totally reprehensible and totally awful, his own demise is brought about by what could be conceived of as a redemptive moment. And the ultimate result is that his family and his community that was totally fractured managed to come together and find their own common humanity. So I'm not afraid to write that stuff. People want to call me a Pollyanna, I'll go ahead. I mean, that's what's important to me. And if it's not important to me, I'm not going to be able to persuade the reader that it's important to read it.
I think the advice I would give would be to be more you. And I'm saying that because, my first story sold 21 years ago. And so when I was coming up, people were, their version of encouraging me was like, oh, hey, you can be the Black Stephen King. And then as I started going into more fantasy work, oh, you can be the Black Neil Gaiman. And I'm like, yeah. Or I could be Maurice Broaddus. I could figure out what my unique voice is, and I could bring that voice to bear in whatever I write. So then it doesn't matter what genre I go to, be it horror, be it fantasy, be it science fiction, I'm bringing my voice to those stories, those genres, those stories. And so, and I think that's what's going to set me out. That's what's going to set me apart from the market, from the other. You'll be able to pick my stories out of any lineup because it's going to have my voice, my imprint on it. So I'm always going to encourage a young writer to find their unique voice and then double down into it, no matter the genre. So it's be more you, and then be fearless.
Well, I like that. I like the comment you made. I have it on. I'm working with Post-its here. I'm taking notes on these Post-its. It's on my Post-it to say, hey, you know, one advantage of writing non-fictional fantasy is it helps you be you, it helps you stick out. It's sort of the antithesis. I have friends who are involved in the right to market, Amazon industry, where they're writing very, very fast stories in very, very pulpy genres that need to sell a lot, need to be exactly cookie cutter, exactly the same. And they make more money than I do. But I also believe that no one's going to remember them in 100 years. So sticking out and having a legacy. Let me throw out one last idea. And then I should have asked this up front. I'm not sure when we end. I don't know if we're in our end time now or if we have 8 minutes or what.
Lexi will ping you when it's 5 minutes. I think we got 8 minutes left.
Okay,
Lexi will ping you.
So let me throw out this sort of related idea. I think that that a book attracts an audience, right? I think if you write a book that condescends to readers and spells everything out really in black and white and doesn't require the reader to make any inference and doesn't challenge any of the reader's assumptions or pre-existing mental furniture, you're going to get readers who that's what they want. They want to be spoon-fed a certain kind of story and have it all spilled out. And I think one of the advantages of writing of being willing to break the mold and write different kinds of fantasy is finding readers who don't want that, who want to be challenged, who want to find poetry in unusual places, right? Who want to be shown new things, who want to be made to think.
That's a sort of a subdivision of find readers, which is really what the problem is for any of us. There's 100,000 books out there being published every few months.
Yeah.
How, even if our stuff is the best stuff and exactly what they would want, how do we make sure they see ours? That's of course a different problem. That's the marketing question and so on.
And it's a huge problem, right? And it is the big downside of writing this kind of story.
It's the biggest problem of any writer who isn't immediately being pushed by, a major corporation and getting, major push, because almost anyone who can write decently, I think, could, in theory, make a living from that, because anyone who writes decently probably, there's, all these billions, literally, of people in the world. If you could reach just 1 million of them, you'd be set for life. And that's 1 out of 1,000. Isn't there a chance that 1 out of 1,000 people would like to read what you write, what I write, what Maurice writes, Shoshana, Nathan? Probably.
Yeah.
All we need is 1 million readers.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the payoff is great, right? Because I love meeting a reader, or Maurice, right? It's great to meet a reader who comes up and says, "Dude, I started book 1 and I was like, oh, it's a horror." And then halfway through, I'm like, "Wait, it's a crime story." And then I'm like, "Wait, is this King Arthur?" And then there's a dragon under it, right? And like that blew my mind. That was fantastic, right? Or I'm from this little town that you set this in, right? I think is really rewarding. So okay, well, we're down to about 3 or 4 minutes here, so maybe we can sort of have kind of last words, any last comments, and including tell people where to come find you to solve the problem Reich and I are just talking about, right? Where would you most like them to find you on the internet? Nathan, why don't we start with you here?
Okay, well, readers can find me on Amazon.com, Ring of Fire, and Road. I'm the only author in the universe, by the way, that has the word fire in both of his publishers. Okay. They can find Ring of Fire Press and Word of Fire Press both there. Got 6 books out now. Another one comes out next month. So I guess my only last word would be that I agree with Maurice very heavily, that if you're not happy with what you're writing the wrong stuff. You have to write for yourself. You have to believe in what you're writing. And if it's a hybrid or if it's not a hybrid, then as long as you're doing that, you got a chance to be successful.
Fantastic. Maurice, last comments. Tell us where to find you.
Well, I'm gonna start off by saying I also agree with Maurice. So
He's a smart guy.
Yeah.
Right. You can find me at MauriceBroaddus.com. If you're on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, just go for Maurice Broaddus. So always looking forward to interesting conversations.
Any last comments you want to make in the subject matter at all? Last advice?
No, I think I guess I just keep coming back to be you, be fearless. Because that whole be fearless, believing in yourself and always betting on yourself is going to carry you through a lot of dark nights of the soul. Because this is an up and down business. It's a neurotic business. Well, it's a neurotic creative process, but in a heartbreaking business. But if you're always willing to bet on yourself and always risk, that's what's going to carry you through.
Fantastic. All right, Reich, last comments here. Where to find you?
Well, I can be found lots of places. You search under Reich Spoor. I'll be the first several pages of hits that you find. So Amazon, any other place that sells books online. My own site is Grand Central Arena, all one word, .com. And of course, I'm on Facebook under my own name, so that's easy to find me too. As far as writing, we've already basically said it all. I like writing for the sake of writing. I don't write because I chose to be a writer. I am a writer because writing chose me.
You lucky bastard. Your name is Reich Spoor. You know that there are other writers who publish under Dave Butler. There are other writers under DJ Butler. Any permutation of my
And there's
name.
no other writers under Reich
There's some
Spoor.
other dude squatting on the name. Yeah. All right.
Well, except my dad, but he's dead, so
And he's not writing.
I don't need to worry about competing me. He's not a competition anymore, alas.
All right, Shoshana.
And there's another Nathan Dodge, and his name is a pseudonym.
He stole it.
My writing, my fiction writing can be found on Amazon.com, and I'm publishing more of my short stories there too as a KDP author. I'm of course on Facebook, both under my name and under Shoshana Edwards author, and ringoffirepress.com, of course, and then I have short stories in the Grantville Gazette, which thrills me no end. I'm in the annex of Grantville Gazette. And soon, probably in about 3 months, I'm going to have Death in the Forest finished, which is the second Harper's Landing book. Yay!
Yay.
Congratulations. Well, thank you all.
Where do we find you, Dave?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah, you.
Again, because there are other Dave Butlers and DJ Butlers, my website is probably the easiest place to start to make sure you're actually looking at me. And that's davidjohnbutler.com. John with an H, davidjohnbutler.com. I'm pretty active and try hard to be only moderately offensive on Facebook, so I'm easy to find. Dave.butler.16 is the Dave Butler I am. And I've been on there for a while, too, so there's a lot of Dave Butlers on Facebook. Hey, thank you all very much. I had a great time. And
You did too. Wonderful.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.